Thank you, Ariana, and thank you all for coming today. Well, whenever I give a lecture here, I always try to include as many works from the Museum of Fine Arts as possible, and this one was not a problem because we have here in the museum an unbelievably large collection of Jean-François Millet. Fewer Barbizons, but we do have some. And it's kind of a remarkable thing, the way that Millet was bought up by wealthy Americans in the late 19th century and had an incredibly high reputation for a while, only to be forgotten or really not looked at much for a lot of the 20th century until, for example, 1967, which was the, 1976, which was the centennial of his death, where Robert L. Herbert, who's a great Millet scholar, did an exhibition. And he also, the same art historian, did an exhibition back, I think it was in the 60s, called Barbizon Revisited, and revived interest in them. But the thing is that it's extraordinary that it was really after his life, or at the very end of his life, that Millet got this kind of attention. For a lot of his life, and this is such a familiar story, think Van Gogh, think Cézanne, he really had a struggle. I mean, he did have his admirers, and he exhibited publicly in a way that you have less of, certainly with Van Gogh, and also with Cézanne. Millet did show in the Salon, which was the official government-sponsored art venue, exhibition venue. But at the same time, and he did have his supporters, at the same time he had his detractors. And we'll be talking about that a little bit as we go on today. Now, I called this Earth and Forest, and I'm going to start out with Millet, and I'm really thinking about Earth here. And here we go, our first painting from the MFA, and so many of the ones that I'll be showing you are from the MFA. This self-portrait from 1840 to 41, which really suggests the rural, you could say, origins of this artist, that he was born to a really moderately prosperous farming family. They weren't peasants, even though Millet paints peasants, but they were from Normandy. And he came to Paris. He got a scholarship from the biggest local town, which is Cherbourg. That wonderful old Catherine Deneuve movie, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Well, that's that was kind of the closest big city or big town. And it's at Cherbourg. There's a museum called the Musée Thomas Henry. That museum, and then the collection divided between the Louvre and the Musée d'Orsay, are the only ones that I know of that come anywhere near the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in terms of Millets. And of course you can find others in other parts of the United States, for example, New York at the Met and Chicago. Well, this talented young artist was given a scholarship by the town of Cherbourg to go to Paris and study art. And he actually enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts. It's still there. You can still study painting, sculpture, and architecture. And in the 19th century, it was the place to go for an art career. But he didn't stay very long. He dropped out. He competed unsuccessfully for the Prix de Rome contest and didn't win it. And when he dropped out in 1839, in other words, a year before he painted this, the town cut off his scholarship, and we'll hear more about not very happy relations with Cherbourg to come. But one of the things that's fascinating about Millet, well, there's so many paradoxes about him. As I suggested, looking at when I said that it may suggest his rural origins, what I really meant was there's something kind of frank and forthright and uncosmeticized about this. It looks like, it sort of suggests something that's earthy. And yet at the same time, Millet was a really quite well-read man. He was very fond of literature. He knew the work of Virgil, and he was steeped in the Bible. He also was very aware of the art, for example, of Michelangelo. He never went to Italy, but he certainly knew it through prints. And so you have this kind of sophistication which is not on display with Millet, but which comes out in certain subtle ways. Now, this sense of sort of frank, almost country forthrightness, you also find, and here again, we're staying in the Museum of Fine Arts, with this portrait of his young wife. You can see tragically died when she was only 23. I think she died of TB, which, I always tell my students the 19th century was not a good time to get sick. They could sort of cut things off and they could give you opiates, but that was about it. They did have a vaccine for smallpox, but other than that, they couldn't do much for you, especially if you got TB. But anyway, so she died. But there's a kind of sort of almost dour, humorless, straightforward, kind of austere Puritan quality to both of these portraits that's really striking. So his young wife dies, and he takes up with Catherine Lemaire, who is a servant in Cherbourg. And his father does not approve of this. They actually moved to Le Havre for a while, which is where Monet grew up. And then they go to Paris. And Catherine Lemaire, quite a bit later, he has a civil wedding with a civil marriage to her. And then in 1875, when he's bedridden, the year before he dies, they have a Catholic marriage. But they have 9 children together. So that's he was productive in more ways than one. But now this one also is in the MFA. And it's a remarkable drawing. You can see that Millet is a very fine draftsman, but he's not a refined draftsman. He works in a very kind of muscular, bold manner, and there's a kind of an earthiness to the way that he puts down the chalk here that's analogous, you could say, or fitting to this provincial woman who he is drawing here, but very much, drawing her with affection. Now, this is also in the MFA, and it's often up. And I always have to get my complaint in when I'm showing anything 19th century for the MFA. There's so many wonderful things in this collection, not just Millet, but other 19th century things that you almost never see. And I'm hoping that someday they'll do for 19th century Europe what they've done for the American collection. That would really be spectacular, and they could really fill it with amazing things. And even the stuff that I'm going to show you today from Millet, it's not everything. There's lots of other paintings. There's lots of drawings. This is really just a sample, but they often do have this up. The End of the Hamlet of Grouchy, a work of 1866, and it's really a rather remarkable painting. Grouchy is where he grew up. It's the little hamlet, the little village on the coast of the English Channel, which you see here. You couldn't actually see the channel from his house where he grew up, but if you went down to the end of the town, the little hamlet, it's not even really a town, you could see the water. And there's something wonderfully kind of nostalgic about this painting, because he's doing this later on in life. He doesn't live in that area anymore. This is long after he moved to Barbizon. But there is something soft about the handling, generalizing. There's a little child and a woman here who's sort of holding up a little child to look at the water. There's also this sort of storm-blasted elm tree, which takes on a kind of personal aspect, sort of like, the man Millet himself, sort of withstanding the batterings of life. And this whole idea of seeing his place of origin, or seeing peasants, because he grew up around peasants. As I said, they weren't a peasant family, the Millets. They really were much more affluent than that, but they were farmers. But he sees them through this filter, this kind of generalizing filter. I want to say idealizing, but I don't want to suggest idealizing in the sense of that it was meant at the academy, with, based on classical antiquity or something like that, or beautiful bodies. It's nothing like that. But it does have this sense of being larger than the individual, somehow more generalized. Well, I want to start off with a rather remarkable event that takes place in the early career of Millet. As I mentioned, and I wanted to show you, first of all, here's another wonderful portrait, self-portrait of Millet, this time not from the MFA, but it shows him with this wonderful beard and long hair, where really you see him identifying, say, with the artists, the poets, the bohemians of Paris at this point in his life, because that's really where he is. And I also am showing it to you because you can see the resemblance, and I'm sorry this painting is pretty damaged, but you can see the resemblance here in this very strange image, a self-portrait as Moses. And I want to show you this. I actually wrote a book, the book that Ariana mentioned, The Broken Tablets, The Cult of the Law in French Art, from David de Delacroix, it's all about Moses and representations of Moses, and that's where I came upon this picture. I mean, it had been published as a picture fairly obscurely, but I sort of put together, what was going on here. Now, what happened is I want to go back to when Millet's scholarship was terminated by the city of Cherbourg. Well, that probably didn't make him feel very good about the town, but then something happened that was to sort of add insult to injury. They asked him to do a portrait of someone named Colonel Javin, and Javin had been a mayor of the town, and he was dead, so Millet couldn't look at him. And what they did was they gave him a little miniature picture, and they said, well, here, use this. Well, he painted the portrait, which is now in the Musée Thomas Henry, and it's a somewhat awkward portrait, but they didn't like it. They said, no, this is no good. So and they weren't going to pay him. And they did eventually decide to pay him, but they were going to pay him a third of the commission. But before Millet even learned that they were going to pay him that small sum, he wrote them a letter that I want to read to you. He sent them this painting, Self-Portrait as Moses. And he said, this is what he wrote to them. You will receive in a few days a painting that I beseech you to accept. I hope that this feeble result of my labors, so generously encouraged by you, justifies the expectation that determine your honorable choice. I have perhaps waited long to express my gratitude toward you, but you will understand, I am sure, that this delay was not caused by an ungrateful negligence. I have only waited until I felt capable of delineating some work worthy of you. In the painting that I submit to your good will, I have sought to represent Moses. I did not believe that I could offer a subject more appropriate to the magistrates of the city of Cherbourg than the image of this ancient and severe legislator of the Hebrews. I can only attest anew, messieurs, to the gratitude of a schoolboy whose first efforts have been aided by you and to his keen desire to succeed in bringing you satisfaction. So this is extremely aggressive stuff. And the thing that really makes sense here is that Millet had been in Paris. In Paris, it was really a commonplace, a cliche at this point, among the sort of bohemian set, that the artist and the poet were the legislators of mankind, and that they were supposed to lead everyone. It's the sort of rhetoric that you find associated with a utopian group called the Saint-Simonians that was very much there. So Millet would have been steeped in this. And so what he's really doing is he's saying, he's asserting his authority against this provincial town. The other thing that's really interesting, it may be a little hard to see, but the commandments are numbered, and he's pointing to number 8, the prohibition to bear false witness. So they were breaking his contract, and also they were expecting him to bear false witness by doing, showing this, using this, inferior painting as the source for his portrait. So I wanted to dwell on that for a moment simply because it suggests Millet did have a certain rebellious streak, and it also, in a sense, gives you an alert that he is really someone who's going to be supported by, that is, critically supported by critics on the left, people who really were, you could say, in the opposition. Now, I want to jump right to Millet's mature work with this remarkable painting called The Winnower, which was shown in the Salon of 1848. Now, for a long time, this painting was lost. It was discovered in an attic in the United States. I think it was in 1972. Now it's in the National Gallery of London. And it's quite a remarkable thing. But first, I want to tell you about this Salon. The Salon of 1848 took place it opened in March of 1848, and right before that, in February, was a revolution, the revolution of 1848. And this was an absolutely, world historical event. 1848 was a little bit, had the kind of world historical international significance the way that 1989 does. You know how, the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union falls, all of those communist governments. Well, something like that happened in 1848, but it was somewhat different. What happened in 1848 is that you had the successful revolution in France, and then it spread all over Europe. But it wasn't successful in other places. For example, in Germany, that's when you got a lot of German immigrants coming to the United States because it was repressed there. But it did succeed in France. It overthrew the last constitutional monarchy that France ever had. That was the July monarchy, where King Louis Philippe had been on the throne. He's the one that Daumier used to make fun of and make him look like a pear. That was overthrown. And the thing that was so remarkable about this revolution, and it was really unlike any other French revolutions before this, is that it was a social revolution. It wasn't just about politics. It was in part about politics, but it was social. And what I mean by that is that the issues had to do with unemployment, homelessness, hunger. These are mass issues, and it's no accident that these issues were coming to the fore right around this time. It's no accident that that's the year that the Communist Manifesto was written, that somehow there is this moment in mid-19th century when all of these pressing social issues come to the fore. And in France, this issue of homelessness, of wanderers, was a big issue because France was always traditionally primarily an agricultural rural country, and you had all of these people leaving small villages, coming to the cities to look for work and not finding any. So one of the things that the revolutionaries did when they had this revolution was they instituted national workshops where people could get work. Well, they stopped them shortly afterwards, and then there was another phase in the revolution where the more radical contingent rose up and they were violently put down. Now, the interesting thing about Millet is that he took no part in the Revolution of 1848. His supporters, people who wrote about his work praisingly, and he thanked them for their praise, and he agreed with it. Those were people on the left, but Millet himself did not get involved in politics, apart from the fact that he apparently volunteered to help put down the radical uprising that took place in June after the February Revolution. But anyway, when this painting was shown in the Salon of 1848, it got in part because this was considered a free salon. That is, traditionally, the salon had a jury. You had to get by the jury. And later on, when I start showing you the Barbizon artist, the work of, the most famous of them, Théodore Rousseau, he was perpetually brutalized by the jury. That is, he was kept out of the salon for most of a good deal of his career, the second half of the 30s and all the way up to the Revolution. But after the Revolution, the whole idea was, well, now we have fraternity. We have, liberty, equality, fraternity. Let's have an open salon where you don't have to submit to the jury. So Millet has this painting. Now you'll notice it's a peasant. It's a peasant who's laboring. He is sifting grain. He's winnowing grain. And it's painted with a kind of rough character. In fact, one of the critics said that that somehow it had a roughness that went along with the roughness of the subject. There's nothing refined here. And at the same time, it has a kind of monumentality, a kind of generality. It's not a specific person, but a kind of generalized type. And this is really going to be very, very typical of Millet's work. Now, one of the other things I should tell you about the Revolution of 1848 is that one thing that was very much on the minds of the people who did make that revolution were the provinces, the provincials. Remember how you have all these people leaving little towns in the provinces, coming to the city, and there was this sense that somehow the French provinces, this sort of the heartland, was changing, something was being lost. And so you have people on the left, in other words, people who supported the revolution, very nostalgic about the provinces, very nostalgic about peasant life. And so when Millet comes on the scene and he starts doing these peasants, peasants. Not just peasants, but monumental peasants. There's nothing pretty about them. There's nothing cute, nothing picturesque. You can see how some of the people who had that sort of ideology, who loved the provincial world of the peasants, really came to his support. Now, one of the artists that he befriended, or at least knew at this time, was Daumier, and I mentioned Daumier before. Now, Daumier was much more political than, and on the left, than Millet. And Daumier, like Millet, heeded the call of a competition that was held after this revolution took place to come up with an emblem for the new republic. And the government, by the way, it's a very brief government. It's just a few years, doesn't last very long. But it's called the Second Republic. That's the government that's brought in with the Revolution of 1848. It's called the Second Republic because the first one was during the French Revolution. That is the Revolution of 1789. That created the First Republic. So the Second Republic is just February of 1848 until December of 1851. That's when the nephew of Napoleon, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, stages a coup d'etat. He had gotten himself elected president of the Second Republic. But so it's a very short period that I'm talking about here. So what I'm showing you on the right is a sketch or a study that was painted by Daumier called The Republic that he submitted to this competition. Now, apparently nobody won the competition, so it wasn't very successful. And I don't think we have Millet's entry. But the one by Daumier is quite remarkable. It has the whole problem of, well, we have a new form of government, a new kind of ethos, this sort of, belief in equality in the people. How do you emblematize this? How do you make this into an emblem? So what he came up with was this monumental woman who's nursing these Herculean children, holding the tricolored French flag enthroned, and then you see another one of these mighty children here reading, and that probably is a reference to universal education. It was one of the ideals. Universal suffrage also, that was one of the new things that you get with this republic. And what you have in Daumier is somewhat analogous to what you have in Millet. That is the sense of something that's not at all idealized in this sort of academic sense, but something which is monumental and weighty and ambitious, has a kind of a solemnity and gravity. And that's something that we also feel about this Winnower by Millet. And I wanted to suggest also, by showing you a later work by Daumier, this is called The Laundress from around 1863, that Daumier in some ways can be considered an urban counterpart to Millet. Millet is the urban, or you could say Millet is the urban, Millet is the rural counterpart to Daumier. Daumier is the urban counterpart. As in this painting of a laundress. Now, laundresses were terribly exploited in this period. They used to do their washing in these laundry barges along the Seine. And anyway, so here is a laundress carrying laundry with her child. And you can see that it's very much generalized, this kind of generalized cityscape in the background, these rounded forms like what you have in the Millet. And that really suggests, thinking about Michelangelo, thinking about high art. And this is one of the paradoxes about what we call mid-century realism. And both Millet and Daumier and Courbet as well all fit into this category, mid-century realists. These are artists who really wanted to paint things that had actuality. In some cases, the here and now, the contemporary things. Although in Millet, there's nothing particularly contemporary about it. It really has a timelessness. But what they also, and they didn't want to idealize things. They wanted something that was had a kind of a roughness of actuality, of reality. But at the same time, they really wanted both ways. They also want to have some of the grandeur of the museum, of the old masters. And that's very typical. And I didn't want to suggest that Millet was coming at this without some kind of knowledge of art history. It's just the kind of things, I mentioned Michelangelo, but another sort of model, an art historical model that was in the air around 1848 that was being approved of, getting the Good Housekeeping seal of approval from the kind of critics like Théophile Thoré or Champfleury. These are critics who liked, say, Millet and Courbet. were the Lenain, the Lenain family, and the most famous one is Louis Lenain. For example, this painting, Peasants at Supper. So this is a 17th century French artist, and he's really, you could say, discovered around this time. And this is a remarkable thing that I remember that my mentor, Robert Rosenblum, used to say that that the art of the past is transformed or remade by the art of the present. In other words, we see things in the past that we never would have seen before, but for what people are interested in the present. And so here, suddenly, this 17th century artist became very interesting because he's also painting people in the provinces, and he's painting them with great dignity and solemnity, a sense of gravity. Nothing prettified or picturesque about this. And I also wanted to make a comparison to the work of Courbet. I've mentioned him a few other times. He's, of course, really the king of all of these mid-century realists. And what I'm showing you here is a painting from just a year after Millet showed the Winnowers, the Stonebreakers. And as I indicated down here below, it's very fortunate that we have a color photo because it was destroyed in World War II in Germany. But it's a remarkable painting. It's often reproduced as an example of Courbet's work. It's somewhat unusual in that it's a painting with what you could call a social consciousness, whereas most of Courbet's work is not like this, especially later on. He specializes, for example, in portraits, in landscapes, in hunting scenes, in nudes that don't have anything to do with hard labor. But this one has everything to do with hard labor. It's these two men breaking rocks out in this rural setting. And back in the mid-19th century, this was how you paid your taxes if you couldn't actually pay your taxes. You had to break up rocks. It was called the corvée, which sounds like corvée, but it's corvée, and it means chore. And it was something that you can imagine was really detested. And Courbet, who apparently saw these two men doing this, got the idea to do this painting. And what he does is he really gives you a sense of the sort of bone-grinding labor, and it has this sense of angularity in the poses. It looks painful. In other words, there's nothing fluent or mellifluous about these poses. They have a kind of an ungainliness and awkwardness. And at the same time, that you could say that both of these, monumentalize hard labor. They really are very, very different. That sense of angularity in the Courbet is really contrast with these rounded forms that you get, the sort of rounded bulky forms that you get in the Millet. But also one of the other aspects of Courbet is that he tends to focus on one thing at a time, and everything is additive. In other words, there's nothing tying this composition together. In fact, there really isn't much of a composition at all. It's just sort of this thing, A plus B plus C, the C being this wonderful still life of this pot with their lunch. Whereas in Millet, everything is bound together. It has this wonderful sense of rhythmic unity, very different kind of thing. And coming back to the MFA, we have in 1850 the Sower, another one of these monumental peasant paintings. Now, I put up at the top that in 1849, the year before this, Millet moves to Barbizon, and we'll be talking more about Barbizon. It's a little village that's nearby the forest of Fontainebleau, and forest of Fontainebleau is about 40 miles from Paris, southeast of Paris. And originally, the forest of Fontainebleau, there's a palace there, the Palace of Fontainebleau, which still stands, which was the palace of Francis I, François Ier. And some of that area that's now around the forest is parkland, because it was sort of set aside for, it was really a hunting preserve for the king. And so what happens is that in 1849, there's an outbreak of disease, I think it was cholera, and Millet moves to Barbizon. He goes with Catherine and his children, and I don't think he had all 9 of them quite at that point, but he had some. And they actually walked to Barbizon, and then he stayed there. That's really where he largely remains, although he still does do some traveling in other parts of the country. And the thing about Barbizon is that it becomes a kind of an art colony. And we'll see this later with the Barbizon painters. It really is a kind of a magnet for people who want to be in a setting where they feel that it's unspoiled by society, by civilization. It's a kind of a place to go for peace and for immersing yourself. And there's this forest. In addition to that sort of parkland, there also is, there are kind of wild rocks and oaks and things like that were very exciting to the painters. Now, with the Sower, and we don't know, this might be the one that he showed in the Salon. There's a couple of versions of it, but the MFAs might be that one. But in any case, it really has some of the same qualities that I talked about in regard to the winnower. That is this sense of anonymity, of generalization. We don't even really see his features at all, but also a sense of monumentality. And this is one of the things that makes it very different from the stonebreakers that I just showed you. I mean, that you could say Courbet was doing peasants on a large scale. But and even though both of the Sower and the stonebreakers, you can say, are engaged in hard labor, the Sower has a certain sense of dignity that you really don't find with the stonebreakers. They really are kind of the, grinding away in misery. And there's something about this, it has something to do with that dignity, the monumentality, that even suggests something biblical. And the way that he is sowing, it's pessimistic at the same time. Look at the birds in the background as if they're going to eat the seed. There's something also about this horizon, the hill that comes behind him that really dramatizes his stride as he goes forward. And I wanted to I wanted to point out then that in these monumental sort of figure paintings, and here is a detail of it, taken from the MFA's painting. He really has this sense of generalization, and in a way, this is his version of doing what was taught in the École des Beaux-Arts. In other words, the École des Beaux-Arts, they taught you to idealize, make faces more like a beautiful ancient statue. Well, he's not going to do that, but he's not going to make it look like an actual person either. He's going to generalize in this kind of way. Now, I mentioned that there was this kind of biblical aspect, and he was reading the Bible. I mean, this is something that he really admired enormously, just as he did, literature, Virgil. And here's another painting from the MFA, a really important one, which is actually up now, Harvesters Resting, and you'll see that it's also titled Ruth and Boaz. Now, of course, from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And that's apparently how it started. It was originally going to be a painting of the story of Ruth and Boaz, but instead, Ruth who gleans in Boaz's field, he changed it into a kind of a scene of French peasants. And, you could say that they're 19th century peasants, but there's something timeless about their clothing. The whole thing, it has that sense of weightiness, of generalization, and this idea of going back and forth between the peasants, the French peasants on the one hand, and the Bible on the other. It really is an extraordinary thing that goes along with this sense of trying to bring solemnity and grandeur and dignity to these kinds of subjects. Now, if you get a chance, I really recommend that you go to Manhattan and see the Delacroix show, which just opened recently. But Delacroix was not an admirer of Millet, and I want to read you a rather nasty thing he wrote about Millet that has exactly to do with this, the ambitious aspect of his peasants, and the way that Millet was thinking about, say, Michelangelo in the Bible. So this is a passage from Delacroix's journal. I mean, it's a very famous journal that he kept over many years, and he wrote about all kinds of opinions about his contemporaries, about art. So on April 16th, 1853, so not really, say, in the year that he finished this painting, Delacroix was really annoyed because somebody had brought Millet around to his studio, and it sort of ruined his morning. He says, "During the morning, someone brought Millet to me. He speaks of Michelangelo in the Bible, which he says is, or almost is, the only book that he reads. That explains the rather ambitious character of his peasants. He is certainly of the constellation or squadron of bearded artists who made the revolution of 1848, or who applauded it, apparently thinking that there would be equality of talents as well as fortunes." Now, in some ways, he's maligning Millet, because as I said, he didn't actually make the revolution of 1848, but he certainly was appreciated by people who applauded it, and as far as we know, he probably applauded it himself. And for Delacroix, the revolution of 1848 was very, very disturbing. Delacroix is the one who painted the famous Liberty Leading the People. I'm sure many of you know. It's in the show in New York. That is a celebration of the revolution of 1830. And the 1830 revolution, the one that brought in the July monarchy and Louis Philippe, that was fought for political purposes. It was fought because the Constitution had been violated. It didn't really have anything to do with these social issues. When these social issues come in 1848, that's very disturbing to someone like Delacroix, who really has a rather aristocratic outlook on the world. But anyway, this really comes back to this paradox of wealthy Americans in the late 19th century or early 20th century being great Millet connoisseurs. Because in his lifetime, in Millet's lifetime, especially in 1857, when he showed the Gleaners, and I'm sure many of you know this painting, it's one of his most famous. He was attacked by people, say by bourgeois viewers, salon visitors, who were really horrified by this painting. They saw it as a kind of a red flag, a kind of a call to rebellion. But there's nothing about it that really suggests that. But that's because these are not just any kind of farm workers. These are gleaners. And I mentioned the story of Ruth and Boaz earlier, and certainly whenever Millet does images of people gleaning, that must have been in his mind. So it's a very ancient kind of activity, but it was actually a kind of an ancient privilege, but of a very lowly kind. Gleaning is not harvesting. The harvest has already gone by, and you can see it's this very bounteous harvest. It's all loaded on these wagons. Gleaning was going along after the harvest and picking up all the little droppings that they had missed. So it's for the poorest of the poor, and it was actually controlled. It was sort of policed, and that's why you have this constable on a horse over here. So these are the desperately poor women, but they're shown with a kind of solemnity and monumentality. I mean, on the one hand, you can say that their backbreaking labor is really being emphasized. Look at how the horizon weighs down on the back of this woman. And at the same time, there's something very grand about all of this, the kind of, AAB rhythm of this, the way that this sense of bulk in these figures really makes you think of, say, a Sibyl by Michelangelo. I'll show you one in a moment. It's that idea of the mid-century realist wanting it both ways, wanting it both, say, homespun and unidealized, and on the other hand, having the same kind of grandeur, gravitas, gravity in both sense of the words, both in the sense of gravity that, in the Newtonian sense that pulls you to the ground, that's weighty, and at the same time that's grave, that's solemn. it has that quality. You can also see that Millet was a wonderful painter of landscape, that he really gives you this sense of heat and dryness. And we're going to see that landscape is something that Millet really is really going to practice very well. This is just a detail of one of the Gleaners, just to show you again the anonymity. So that this anonymity, it not only raises these figures in a sense of solemnity and grandeur, but it also suggests every man or every woman. In other words, it's not just one individual, but it's a kind of universal thing. Now, the thing is that even though Millet, this is another one of these paradoxes, even though he was supported by critics who were associated with the left, and even though he thanked them and went along with what they said about his paintings, you never get a sense when you're looking at these Millet peasants that they're even capable of rebelling. It looks like they're doing something that's been going on since time immemorial, and which has the kind of inevitability of the cycle of the seasons. And the seasons are something that Millet was very aware of. He did a wonderful set of paintings of the four seasons. The autumn one is in the Metropolitan Museum. And I'll show you some pastels shortly that are on view now here at the MFA, which have a really wonderful evocation of different seasons. Here is that comparison I wanted to make. And as I said, Millet never went to Italy, but he would have known the work of Michelangelo, say, through engravings. And what I'm showing you here is one of the Sibyls of the Sistine Chapel, the Cumaean Sibyl. And I picked her because of this sort of ponderous way that she's bent over that book. It just reminds me of these, reminds me of the Gleaners. And I also wanted to suggest that Millet went about paintings like the Gleaners very carefully. He did all kinds of preparatory work, and that in itself was something that he would have learned in art school. That was the traditional way of doing things. But this is a rather vigorous drawing, but you can see that he really hadn't arrived at that very grand, monumental arrangement of the three figures that he has in the paintings when he did the drawing. Now, on view in this wonderful pastel show that's here right now at the MFA, which is really the occasion for this lecture, you can see another image of labor. It's this remarkable pastel of these two men turning over soil, the way that you have a kind of a counterpoint between the two gestures. In some ways, it's a pastel that really makes me think about how Van Gogh was going to be a great admirer of Millet, and we'll come back to that later. I mean, he also did some incredible images of people laboring outside and peasants laboring. And in this, even though this is primarily a figural pastel, it also has a very telling evocation of the landscape, of breaking away this earth here, and then the plains or the fields in the back. And at the same time, as we have an image like that, which really, the two men shoveling, that it really has this sense of powerful labor, he has other images of farm labor that are much more quiet. This one is also in the MFA, and it's one of his great paintings, the Potato Planters of around 1861, which shows a man and the wife here is dropping these sort of seed potatoes in, with the man is digging holes and burying them. And the whole thing has a kind of quiet about it that's really remarkable, a weightiness, a ponderousness. Even the wonderful image of this donkey back here behind the tree. Also a nice sense of landscape, the expanse here. But this idea of labor as something that can also be very quiet and is eternal. I mean, that's the sense you get with these, that somehow, these are, activities that look like they've been going on for time immemorial, and that, have this kind of slow development with with the seasons. And so when you're looking at something like this, you can say, well, he's really thinking about, French 19th century peasants, but there's nothing to really tell you that they're 19th century peasants. There's something much more generalized and timeless about them. And that's also the case with this marvelous pastel, which is on view right now, of this man training grapevines. And you also get this terrific, orchard view here in the background. And, something very quiet and simple, but very specific. I mean, even at the same time that he generalizes the figures, he often doesn't show their faces. And what we're getting into here, and this really brings us to the exhibition, is that around the time of the 1860s, Millet really starts using pastel a lot. And pastel, is of course colored chalk. And it allows him to draw in color, which is a really interesting kind of effect. I mean, pastel has a really interesting history. Of course, in the same exhibition, you can see those wonderful Degas pastels. And Degas, of course, turned to pastel in the latter part of his career when his eyes were not very good. And, it has a kind of tactile aspect. You can imagine, Degas, moving around with his thumbs, just as he did those little, like the little horse that's upstairs, working with his hands when his eyes were not at their best. But in the case of Millet, also discovering these really, really wonderful qualities in this in pastel. And then these are two more from the exhibition. And one of the things that they suggest by putting them together is how he sometimes would have similar motifs that he would repeat. In other words, he would have something that he liked and then repeat it in different versions. Both of these actually are, this one in particular is there's a painted version of it. I think there's one of this one as well. And so sometimes you would have the painting and then you would have a drawing or a pastel. Now, one of the things about this one is that at one point, and the critic was really talking about the painted version, some people thought that there was something sentimental and religious about Millet's work, so that they even thought that she's praying. She's not, she's knitting. But this is one of the things about Millet's work, especially in his later years. Some of the people who appreciated him tended to appreciate the more sentimental aspects of his work. But another thing about these two pastels is that they have this look of twilight. And twilight was a time that Millet really came to like. And there were really, it seems, two reasons for this. One of them was the sense of melancholy, and he really did talk about that as, that in the twilight, the sort of melancholy feeling comes out. But the other is that the twilight really sort of aids and abets him in this generalizing. It makes it so that contours are indistinct, so that things run together, and that's really very much working in his favor. And you also see it in this image of watering horses, again, in the current show, where the horses, really become very indistinct, but, they're there. You can see what they are, and it actually is, he's captured this moment of the peasant, turning around, looking at the horses, and the far bank of this water is really become very, filmy and indistinct. But it's all happening now because we're entering at the very beginning of twilight. As it says that this is sunset, and this kind of quality can be taken very far. And again, I'm just staying within the exhibition, the current exhibition. This after the day's work from around 1863 is really taking us sort of beyond twilight, really into the, very late twilight, really into the time of, where the moon is out in full. And it's really remarkable how he's worked the pastel here to give you a sense of the darkness. It's interesting, again, I think about Van Gogh. When Van Gogh started out just adoring Millet, when the first time Van Gogh went to Paris, and he could have seen Impressionist paintings, he wasn't interested in them. He just wanted to see Millets. And then the second time he went, well, that was over. Now he wants to see Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Japanese prints. And he decided that Millet was too gray. But Millet really stayed with him, and when he was ill, when he was hospitalized, Millet is one of the artists whose prints after Millet that he copied. But what I'm thinking about here is that just as Millet had this taste for darkness and twilight, Van Gogh wrote in his letters to his brother Theo about how wonderful the night is, about how the night has all of these colors that people just don't notice. So think about Starry Night, for example, or The Night at the Café Lamartine, these famous paintings by Van Gogh. Now here, of course, you don't really have any hue at all. Hue, that's the technical term for color. You really just have values or tones, that is darks and lights, but they're incredibly nuanced. And here is a detail of that figure, the mounted figure here with a whip underneath the moon. And the artist who, in some ways, not just Van Gogh that this makes us think of, but a contemporary of Van Gogh, and I think about that especially, this is a wonderful work, again, in the MFA, this Twilight, and that's Sower. He's someone that Robert Herbert, who was the curator of that big Millet show back in 1976, talked about this drawing, it's sort of pastel and drawing, as a kind of, something that the only artist who really did anything like this in many ways in this period, and that was later, say about 30 years later or 25 years later, was Sower, and, giving you this kind of atomized handling of the pencil and the chalk. Of course, in the case of Sower, it was done somewhat differently. Sower would work on paper that, if you put it under a magnifying glass, would look almost like corduroy. It's a paper with what you call a pronounced tooth, and so you would deposit the charcoal on the little ridges, and it was a kind of equivalent to his pointillist handling. I mean, if you come to my lecture on post-impressionism, which is in December, we'll talk more about that then. But in any case, in Millet, you have this, as I said, this taste for twilight that generalizes everything and really transforms something that's very ordinary. I mean, what's more ordinary than just some people out, the peasants out, on their land with, with some sheep, but it sort of makes it into a kind of extraordinary experience. It's a little bit like what Whistler said about that moment of twilight, which was his favorite time, when he said that chimneys, like smokestacks, become campanile. In other words, they become Italian bell towers. It's a famous statement by Whistler. And in this pastel, which is also in the show, he really takes us completely into night. So it's this farmyard by moonlight where you just can pick out the wheelbarrow and the dog, and it's wonderful the way that he's made these shadows coming from the gate, shadows cast by the moon. And then there are other pastels in the show that show another aspect to this work, which is a kind of frank discovery of unexpected points of view. And like this one, the little goose girl, and it's interesting that in this one, and in some of the others, the human presence is very small. They really become much more landscapes than anything else. But this kind of view up the hill to these farm buildings has a real kind of freshness to it, which you also find, and this is one of my favorites, this path through the wheat, where it really is a very surprising, fresh point of view. And the man who's going through this sort of trail here, you barely see him. He's just sort of peeping out above the wheat. in this really surprising manner. There's also this one, the Rabbit Warren Dawn. So this is kind of a counterpart to the Twilight, but now this is showing a scene at dawn where there's, talk about no human presence. It's just this rabbit warren. You can see the holes here, and a rabbit here looking out in this dawn landscape, again with this kind of unexpected incline that it's really surprising. And in some ways, I mean, even though he's so different from, say, a Degas or a Mary Cassatt, you find in their work, that in those Impressionist work, this interest in these kinds of unexpected points of view, which in their case really is inspired by Japanese prints. But in his case, it really seems to have something to do not so much with that, because I don't think there's any evidence that he was interested in them, but rather in some ways he's somewhat early for that. I mean, they were around at that point, 67. I mean, but I think it has more to do with just observing, getting down low in the landscape and seeing. And the other thing is that Millet, like the Barbizon artists, would do sketches on the spot. That's what these these pastels seem to have really been. They seems to really have worked in that way. Whereas his finished work, his more monumental works like the Gleaners or the Sower or the Winnower, those are things that were clearly done in the studio very carefully. And one of the strongest of all of these is the Farmyard in Winter from 1868. Which is, again, in the show of Pastels, this marvelous winter scene. And one of the things that Robert Herbert points out about this in the catalog to that 67 exhibition is that there's a real sense of personal references here. The animals, the chickens, well, that could be a reference to a former friend of his, another one of the Barbizon artists whose name was Charles Jacques. Well, he wasn't really a friend anymore because apparently Jacques had started buying land around the area of Barbizon, and the other Barbizon artists did not go for that. But there's another more poignant reference, which is that in the year before, his best friend, Théodore Rousseau, who we're going to hear more about, had died. He had died in Millet's arms. Millet had taken care of him while he was sick and dying. And so this winter scene, painted shortly after that, in some ways is an elegiac painting, winter and death. You think about that together. But it's all done in these very, clear-sighted, descriptive passages. And, the way that he shows the winter landscape, the atmosphere in the back is very persuasive. Now, in some ways, I think the stars of the pastel show are two very humble flower pieces, and this is one of them. Primrose it's actually a type of primrose called a cowslip that we see here, and it really is a remarkable pastel. It's this idea of being so respectful of the most humble kind of plant that you're going to get sort of right down with the plant and do this very close-eyed view. In some ways, it really is something that brings to mind Van Gogh. I mean, in terms of close views of plants. I mean, think about Van Gogh's paintings. There's one in the Metropolitan Museum of sunflowers where they're lying on a table. He's very close, or also some of his other looks at irises and things like that are very close-eyed. It really has some of that aspect. But the idea of taking such a humble, really a weed, and paying so much attention to it, and getting down so close so that a snail looks rather large, it really, and it's also very much this side of Millet that we can associate with working out of doors, of actually capturing something on the wing. I mean, it's really hard to imagine that he wasn't there with his pastels, actually drawing this. And I mentioned Van Gogh, but there's another artist who comes to mind here, and I don't know whether Millet was even aware that he existed, but that's Albrecht Dürer. And what I'm showing you here is a very famous watercolor by Albrecht Dürer called The Great Piece of Turf from the early 16th century. And regardless of whether he knew the work of Dürer, I think that it's valid to put them together simply because it suggests an analogy between, or an affinity that Millet has to this kind of northern sensibility that you have in Durr, a northern sensibility that has to do with particularity, respecting the particularity of humble plant. I mean, that's a very northern kind of thing that you find in Durr. And just as Durr took this little piece of very humble nature, you can see dandelions again, some kind of like odor wheatgrass, something like that, things that are very, very simple and humble, but paying this exquisite attention to them, almost like you're looking at them through a kind of magical spyglass, which sort of takes everything that's extraneous but away from this very humble scene. Now, it's interesting to put these two together because in some ways, in comparison, the Millet looks a little more dramatic. That is, that you can see how Millet has made choices to throw the light on these humble wildflowers and then have everything around them in the darkness. So it really, there is a sense of drama here that perhaps isn't in the Durr, which seems much more regular in terms of its attention. Now, of course, the other great star of that show are the dandelions, and that's why I chose them for the handout. I mean, really remarkable. I mean, you could say a lot of the same things about it, that it's this incredibly close-eyed view where the scale of the dandelions really becomes large. It's almost like you're very small, as if you're the size of one of the snails or those little flowers, and they're looming up. But you really get the sense of Millet sort of immersing himself in this very humble site, that he is really using the pastels to show in all of their particularity. And this is just a detail of these marvelous dandelions, shown with this, that he's done with pastel. Now, I want to jump back to something that seems to have very little to do with the world of Millet, although there's more than meets the eye here. And that is, I wanted to show you an example of a work by Nicolas Poussin. It's a biblical painting, and it's from a cycle of the seasons. This one is summer, and you can see it's the story of Ruth and Boaz. And remember how Millet himself had thought of Ruth and Boaz as sort of the origin of his haymakers resting that I showed you earlier. Well, the reason why I'm showing you this is I wanted to give you a sense of what classical French landscape looks like, because this is a kind of paradigmatic example. Poussin is about as classic as you can get. He often is classic in the sense that he shows you scenes from classical antiquity, but even when he doesn't, when he shows you something from the Bible, there is a sense of permanence and dignity and monumentality and order that really, and a kind of ideal beauty that really is classical. So what I'm talking about here is that in this landscape, we're really looking at something that is completely imagined. Poussin actually would go outside and do drawings and studies of things like trees, but he never would have thought of showing those. I mean, those were just sort of his homework. All of those things went into doing these very elaborated paintings that are all done in the studio, and they're set up with a sense of the ideal, with a kind of an ideal order whose clarity is the visual equivalent of the high-mindedness of the story. The story, of course, is the story from the Bible, but you can see that it's set out with this tree looking like it's a canopy over the main event. Everything is very artificially created to give you this, or arranged to give you this sense of dignity and order. It's ordered also spatially, so that you have the main event taking place in the foreground, you have a building in the middle ground, and then you have these distant mountains in the rear ground, which are all blued out through what we call aerial perspective. So it's a very orderly kind of arrangement. You also have these alternating bands of dark and light, and dark, and then finally light in the end. And that sort of takes you into the painting like, the sleepers of a railroad. If you look down a railroad track and it takes you into 3 dimensions, it has this sort of striated bands that are bringing you in. And then, of course, the space is also articulated by the linear perspective of these buildings, and the buildings look classical. Classical architecture takes the human scale as its sort of point of reference. So in other words, it's a very humanized landscape. It has this kind of clarity and sharpness. And I can't emphasize enough how much Poussin was really believed to be the kind of model of classical perfection. Cézanne said he wanted to redo Poussin after nature. And, there is the relationship between Cézanne and Poussin is pretty complex, but that statement really suggests that he wanted to bring somehow the naturalness, the directness of the way that the Impressionists painted, the plein air, out-of-doors painting. He wanted to merge that with the kind of structural complexity and soundness and stability that you have in the work of Poussin. Well, I'm saying all of this because I wanted to give you a sense of what landscape looked like going back to the 17th century, but also moving into the 19th century, because landscape in France was very, very conservative. So if Poussin was painting like this in the 1660s, if you jump ahead to the 1780s, which is really a long time after that, this artist, Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes, is still painting in a way that's very, if you describe the painting, it would sound very much like that Poussin. It's a completely idealized space, and it's also a landscape of ancient Greece, so it's as ideal and distant as the world, say, of the Bible. But what I'm also showing you down here is another painting, a small one, by the same artist, by Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes, and it's very different. It's not something that was carefully elaborated in the studio like this. It's something that was actually done outside, a small canvas. If you go to the Louvre, there's a whole sort of wall of these paintings by these outdoor paintings. They're all about so big. And artists like Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes worked in that Poussin tradition, that Poussin-esque tradition. That is, you could make sketches outside, but then you took those and you used those as the homework, as sort of the basis for these very elaborate kind of paintings, like this one, which is in the Detroit Institute of Art. So you have this interesting kind of dichotomy. On the one hand, something that looks so fresh and direct, but then you have this, which is so elaborated, but that's the kind of work that the artist took pride in. And the point is that this Poussin tradition of idealized landscape, what we could call the Franco-Italian tradition, because Poussin, even though he was French, spent a lot of his career in Rome. That tradition is something that really survives well into the 19th century. And it's the tradition that the Barbizon landscape painters, who we're getting to, really are against, that they really are, you could say, on the outs with. And I wanted to emphasize again that this tradition, for one thing, of doing paintings in Italy, of having this kind of ideal clarity and order, that's still being done in the 19th century. And the reason why I chose this one, it's an artist with a Jean-Joseph Xavier Bidot, this painting of this Italian town of Avezzano. I put down here that he painted this when he was 88. Now, the reason why I put that is that this artist, Bidot, was a very old-fashioned landscape painter who was in the academy. That is, he was on the jury of the Salon, and he hated the work of Rousseau. And he made sure that Rousseau, who is really the king of the Barbizon painters and was Millet's best friend, he made sure that Rousseau was kept out of the Salon. And between about 1836 and 1848, every time Rousseau submitted a painting, it was refused. And that's a really remarkable thing, because by the late 19th century, Rousseau, and it'd say also in the early 20th century, Rousseau, like Millet, was very appreciated and bought, especially by wealthy Americans. Well, I wanted to show you an example of a painting by Rousseau, and he is very much a Barbizon painter. I mentioned how Millet moved to Barbizon, and that Rousseau is really his best friend. And, Barbizon, as I said, it attracted artists who wanted to live or be and paint in this, what seemed like an unspoiled place. It was very quaint. It had these forests. And what you have in a painting like this one, this Under the Birches, and they're not just done in we call them the Barbizon painters, but just like the Hudson River School painters didn't just paint in the Hudson River Valley. They painted in various places in the United States. Similarly, the Barbizon artists painted all over the place, but they were centered, that was kind of their headquarters or spiritual headquarters in Barbizon. So this is actually in a place called the Berry region of France, and it's just this wonderful autumnal scene with the light hitting these birches. There isn't any sense of an artificial arrangement the way you would have in a Poussin, and there are these very strong effects of light and dark, this kind of strong chiaroscuro. Here's a detail, and that's the kind of thing that also was very disturbing to a traditional sort of Poussin-esque landscape painter. Rousseau made sketches outdoors, and you have to understand that an artist like Rousseau is really a kind of progenitor to the Impressionists, a kind of generation before. But he did his final paintings in the studio and worked on them for years sometimes. I want to just jump to one that is in the MFA, this Wooded Stream by Rousseau. It really has some of the typical aspects of his work. There's often a sense of solitude in his paintings. And the Barbizon artists were very attached to the woods. They were very concerned about trees being cut down. They really liked the idea of, you could say it's a little bit like, kind of early ecology. But there is this sense of a kind of solitude, of contemplation, and this it's very much a kind of vernacular sort of painting. And I wanted to just talk about two important influences on the Barbizon artists. And they are an alternative to the Franco-Italian tradition represented by Poussin. This is what we call the Anglo-Dutch tradition. And I'm showing you a very famous painting by John Constable. And this particular painting, the Hay Wain, came to the French Salon of 1824. And after that point, and Delacroix, for one, was absolutely dazzled by it. After that point, his work comes to be known in England, in France, and it really represents a completely alternate way of painting to the Franco-Italian tradition. For one thing, it's vernacular landscape. It's local. It's not Italy. It's not ancient Greece. And it's painted with this great emphasis on the sky. Constable said that the sky was the chief organ of sentiment in a painting. It has these bold effects of light and dark. And of course, Constable was very strongly influenced by Dutch 17th century painters. And this one is actually in the MFA. I'm really showing it to you as a kind of a generic example of Dutch 17th century painting. But these Barbizons, like Rousseau, were really looking at, say, Constable. They were looking at the Dutch with this strong, bold contrast of light and dark, this great sense of airiness or of vitality that comes in with these with the skies. There was one French artist from early in the 18th century who did have some of that Dutch quality. He really was an exception. His name was Georges Michel, and we often don't know exactly how to date his paintings, like this one up here, The Stormy Scene. And I just thought it would be interesting to see it next to one of the pastels in the exhibition, which by Millet, which also has this storm. I wanted to just show you a little bit of some of the other Barbizon artists, because you could say it was really a colony. Another one was Jules Dupré, who was a good friend of these other artists, of Rousseau, of Millet as well, in this painting of the sluice or the duck pond. And it really has this sense of density, a kind of opacity, which is very typical of these artists. There's also Diaz, or Diaz de la Peña, and in his paintings, he really has this kind of thick opacity, but they're also, the thing that distinguishes his work, like this one here, and I think both of these are in the MFA, there's a sense of fantasy in his work. So it looks almost like, a Rococo Fête Galante by Watteau or somebody like that. And that fantasy that really comes across in this small one in the MFA of these women, we don't know when it was done, but in Turkish costume, but you can see that it has that kind of this bold kind of light and dark passages that's very typical of the Barbizons. And they weren't actually called the Barbizon artists in their time, or at least not initially. They were called the School of 1830, because that's when a lot of them got their start. This is a painting I haven't, these are both in the MFA. I haven't seen this one for quite a while. It's a wonderful painting of a hound pointing by another one of the Barbizons, Constant Troyan. And it really, I put it up here with A Young Shepherdess by Millet, because they both have this real sense of bold monumentality, something very humble but shown as being rather monumental, that really has something to do with the handling of the horizons in these paintings. This one, by the way, at one point, this was when Millet painted this in the early 1870s, so getting toward the latter part of the very end of his life, he actually used an earlier canvas that he had shown in 1848. It was turned the other way, and he painted over it. We actually have an X-ray that you can barely make it out, and it was a very different subject. It was the ancient Hebrews in the Babylonian captivity. And it's an interesting, perhaps a reference to his sense of being exiled in Paris. And that was a topic that was very current. The Babylonian captivity was very current, say, in the 1840s. Anyway, I just wanted to give you this kind of, oh, this must be our warning. Anyway. I just wanted to give you, again, some sense of the range of these Barbizon artists. This is another one, Charles-Émile Jacques, and even though, and he specialized in animals, they're much more literal, they're more kind of mundane than anything that you would find in a Millet. And although Jacques was one of the artists who kind of helped Millet initially, like get one of his first commissions, Jacques was really disliked eventually by the other Barbizon artists, because apparently he bought land and was he sort of became got into capitalism a bit there, and so he really was on the outs with some of them. And so anyway, I wanted to also come to Corot, who's really one of the greatest of these artists associated with Barbizon. Although in Corot's case, he spent a fair amount of time in Italy, and he traveled all over France as well. But I wanted to start with this painting of the forest of Fontainebleau, which, remember, Barbizon is right near there, which has this real sense of freshness and a certain kind of immediacy. But I wanted to point out that his training was really quite different. He studied with classical landscape painters, and one of them was Jean-Victor Bertin. This is a painting from 1810, this forest with Apollo and Daphne, and typical, as is typical in classical landscape paintings, they're historical landscapes. You often have something from mythology or the Bible, like we saw in that Poussin, and it's a very idealized kind of thing. But Corot also, when he was in Italy, really sort of latched onto this idea of going outside and making studies. And what he did here was he did a series, 3 different paintings of the out in the open air in Italy. The forum scene from the Farnese Gardens. This is the midday one. But what you see here is something very different from anything that we saw in either Corot, rather Rousseau or Millet, which is an interest in architecture, in these simple volumes, the kind of geometric shapes. There's a sense here of a kind of serenity and also suspension of time that really is quite remarkable. In terms of making sketches outdoors, this certainly was one of those. A painting called A Bridge at Narny. So he actually used this painting, this sketch, to do a much more refined one. So, working in that sort of Franco-Italian tradition, but this was how it started. That interest in architecture you also see in this well-known Corot, of Chartres Cathedral, which you can see he actually came back to later in his career. And there's nothing romantic about, there's nothing romanticized about the cathedral. It's really shown as this sort of dignified building. And there's this wonderful kind of geometry, build up between the blocks and the mound and then the church here that, has this sense of a certain kind of harmony and that really seems to be one of the things that Corot is after. I mean, another thing is this sort of unity of values of lights and darks that's very typical of Corot. And one of the places he traveled to was Brittany. And he did this painting that looks so timeless, the way that, like the woman who has the vase on her head, and the way that some of the others are in profile. They really, looks like you could be back in the time of the Bible. And Brittany is, of course, where Gauguin went. He was really attracted to what were considered the primitive mores of the people there, who were still very much Catholic, and cut off from the sophisticated world of Paris. Well, what Corot eventually gets into is what's sometimes called his silvery manner. He becomes, as he gets older, much more removed from the kind of palpable world of, that you saw of trees and cows and things like that we saw in the Fontainebleau painting, and does things like this, called the Recollection of Montfortin, and even the word recollection in the title suggests that somehow it's all seen through a filter, through a scrim of memory in distance. And this is the contrast that I meant, from that earlier painting that's really done near Barbizon, and then this one, that's so sort of filtered out. Now, when we look at something like that, it's hard not to think about some of Monet's paintings, like, and here we can be in the MFA, like this Morning at the Seine near Giverny, which of course Monet did a whole series of. And it looks like you took a little piece of this painting and then Monet blew it up into the whole thing. And it's kind of fascinating to think about Monet as being the next generation and how he really is looking, with respect at these Barbizon artists. Rousseau is another one, but completely transforming what they did. I mean, look at this wonderful painting in the Metropolitan Museum. Here is Monet, here is the Rousseau. Rousseau is so dark. Monet banishes those dark colors, and it looks like he does it right on the spot. And look at the hues that come out, these blues in the sky, the orange of the leaves, completely in a different world. The Barbizon painter, I haven't shown you him yet, Charles-François d'Aubigny, who in some ways can especially be compared to Monet because he actually had a studio boat. He went on the Oise River and painted in the boat, which is what Monet did. Later on, for example, when Manet painted Monet and Camille in the studio boat painting outside. And I've mentioned Van Gogh in the past, Van Gogh as this great lover of the work of Millet, and even after he decides that Millet is too gray, he can't seem to get away from him, like in the Sower here, which he also does in this extraordinary version, of course, completely transforming everything in terms of color, and of course now he's so enamored of Japanese prints as well, but still giving you the sense of this lasting legacy. Now, this painting by Millet is, in some ways, his going the furthest into sentimentality of these two peasants listening to the Angelus, the bells of the church. The woman is praying. The man is just sort of holding his hat. And this painting was bought by an American, first of all, for a huge price, taken on tour as the most famous painting in the world. And then, because it was it was repurchased by a Frenchman for 800,000 francs, and then given to the Louvre. And then, of course, not long after that, it becomes so old-fashioned. But this is the kind of painting, this sort of Twilight painting, which also becomes the basis of some really awful propaganda art. So here is beloved Stalin standing among, high tension wires with this kind of, twilight haze out here. Or actually, this one, I'm sorry, not twilight, morning, but very much in a kind of socialist realist version of Millet. But then the strangest thing you get are Salvador Dali's weird riffs on the Angelus, which you see up here. For example, this one, which just has the weirdest title, Gala and the Angelus of Millet, immediately preceding the arrival of the conic anamorphoses. Or this architectonic Angelus of Millet, just totally weird, and in some ways perversely dwelling on something that was considered so old-fashioned at that time. Now, in the same time, Corot somehow seemed very modern in 1909 when a whole group of his figure paintings were included in the Autumn Salon, the Salon d'Automne. And in the next year, Picasso did this early Cubist painting, the girl with the mandolin, and you can see the connection. And Corot did, I don't know if he knew the specific one, but he did a number of paintings of women with mandolins. And the thing that's so interesting is that at this point, in 1910, Corot has become a classic, and he becomes a kind of an anchor against which Picasso can go off into these wild experimental things that we see with Cubism. Well, as I've mentioned today, it's kind of a paradox that these artists, that someone like Millet especially, but also the Barbizons, how they really had to struggle in their lifetime, then had all of this posthumous fame, and then suddenly were, forgotten somewhat until the late or 20th century. But, of course, we're lucky that you had these wealthy Americans like the Shaw family that gave a lot of the Millets, because for them, they weren't really bothered by some of the things that bothered academic viewers in France. They would say, well, I like peasants. Sure, I'll take that one. I like cows. I like trees. I'll take that tree. So for that reason, and the same thing was true of the Impressionists, our museums, like the MFA, are loaded with all of these wonderful things. Well, thank you.